All right, good evening, everyone, um, to you or wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to our Ignite Talk with Mark Beverly, whom I'll introduce at a later part of this session. But warm welcome to you into our virtual space. Just a quick introduction about EduSpots and how we work. So EduSpots connects, trains, and equips over 250 local catalysts. And what our catalysts do is that they transform community learning spaces, which we call spots, through quite a number of activities, educational activities, including literacy, creative literacy for junior high school students, ecosystem that, considers environmental sustainability practices and practical ways of appreciating and learning science. Ignite Equity, which is a strand that focuses on bridging the gap or fostering inclusion among both genders. And then we have our Educate strand, which focuses on our early year learners, through play-based strategies for those in kindergarten to primary school 3. And we thrive on a community-led model where our communities or our sports have full ownership of the activities that they undertake in their communities. And in terms of the quality of learning, you would find that we have impacted over 10,000 children over the past few years. So just with this background of what we do, we also have the Ignite Talk, and I'm glad that you've been able to join us for this particular session. And just to give us a bit of context, this talk is meant to empower us, volunteers, staff members, and wider stakeholders who work with young learners in our communities in Ghana and Kenya. So it's free for everyone to attend, as you'd realize, and it takes place on Zoom. So this will not be the only one you find that every month we run these talks. And today we are particularly grateful to Mark Beverly, who has decided to lead this particular session. And in Ghana, we have a popular adage that everyone has been a child before. I'm sure it's something that resonates with everyone globally. Everyone has been a child before. You've not been an adult before, but you've been a child before. And so to a great extent, I'm sure that this session will speak to us in several ways. It would also empower us as to how well we go in our various professions, in our roles as catalysts in local communities, to nurture that love for learning and to understand the processes by which learners connect to the environment and also make sense of the world. So just to give a bit of context regarding who our guest is, I first met him at Sevenoaks School. I think that was it last year? And I sat in his class to observe his lessons, sat right at the back in his class. And I particularly remember this session he had on using performative arts or drama in one of the texts they were treating. And in that session, I remember that was my first time hearing the word discombobulate. And I kept that word, So I said to myself, I must understand or, come to terms with what this word is all about. And that word has stuck with me throughout the period. And so with that background, Mark is the director of the Institute of Teaching and Learning at Sevenoaks School. He was previously head of English at United World College of Southeast Asia. And also Mark is a workshop leader and examiner and has co-authored several textbooks. And I'm sure that in his own presentation, he will walk us through his experience as well. Mark, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. That's a very kind and very nice introduction. Thank you. So would you like me to get going now, Lawrence, or would you like
Absolutely,
to
Mark.
Okay, great.
We are all yours now.
Okay, they're all mine. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you can now, whoops. I hope you can now, can you see my screen now, Lawrence?
Absolutely, we can see your screen, Mark.
Okay, and if I change slides, can you see the new slide there?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. All right, super. Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. It's a real pleasure to be with you. As you have said, so I'm currently a teacher of English in a school in the UK called Sevenoaks, which is an independent school, and it's a school that teaches students the IB, the International Baccalaureate, which I don't know if people are familiar with. I'm sure you are in some capacity, or maybe you've heard of it. And then, yes, as Lawrence said before, then I was in Singapore. I taught in a big international school in Singapore, where I was head of English. And it's a real privilege to work in two very dynamic, very large, very exciting schools. But I guess in recent years, my main job, I suppose, has been to run what we call our Institute of Teaching and Learning. And this is a kind of research centre, really. We try to encourage staff at the school to reflect on their own practice. We provide opportunities for staff to do some research of their own. And we also, as much as possible, try to introduce into the school practices in the classroom which are informed by research. And I think one of the things that struck me in the last, for 5 years, let's say, is how much stronger the research about education is now, and how practices of teaching and learning have so much more evidence behind them. And I think part of that is because of so much is now known about cognitive science. And it's a very exciting, I think, area to delve into, and the reading and the research that we've undertaken has, in all honesty, changed the way I've approached my own teaching over the last few years. And I've been teaching now for probably 25 years, and I really have really rethought my whole practice in the light of this research. So that's kind of my background. That's kind of my context. I know Lawrence, and I worked, of course, with Kat when she was at Sevenoaks, and I'm always been fully in awe of the work that everybody in the organisation does, and it feels like a real privilege to me to be able to connect with it in some small way. So thank you for inviting me. So what I've been asked to talk about is sort of a number of things. And I'm going to try and do what I can to cover them in the time I have available. I would very much welcome people to interrupt me. So if you have a question or you would like to ask me something or say something, please don't hesitate. Just ask away, so that it's not just me rambling on for however long we have, which I'm assuming is an hour, unless you tell me to stop before then, Lawrence, which I'm very happy to do if that's the case. So I'm going to talk about sort of two main things. The first is the way in which what we now know about learning happens, and the way in which students and, of course, adults acquire knowledge, and the implications of that for us as practitioners in the classroom, but also for the students as learners. And then the second half of my talk is going to be sort of, I suppose, taking all of that into account, but talking about what we can do to engage students in our lessons, and how we can maximize opportunities for students to engage in their learning, and how we can facilitate that. And that's a topic I've become quite interested in over the last couple of years, and I'll try and explain why a little bit later on. So to start with then, and I'm going to say to you this, that the things I'm going to say in the first 10 minutes or so are very much things I've been saying to our students. I teach secondary schools to students, so that means from aged 11 up to 18. So I'm sort of the secondary age. And what I've found is that there is a lot of advantage to be had from talking to the students about learning and about how learning happens. And one of the big themes for me has been to try to encourage students to be more self-reflective and to think about themselves as learners, and to develop what we call metacognitive habits. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So what I'm going to show you now. So the next slide is, sorry, the next slide after this one. I've been speaking to the students really a lot recently about memory. And when it comes down to it, so much I think of good learning is about memory. It's about how you remember things and how you store your memories. And I did an assembly to our students at the beginning of this year, and I've done it a couple of times since to other year groups, to different year groups. And I've tried to describe for them the way in which memory happens and the way in which learning therefore takes place. This infographic is at first glance perhaps a bit confusing, but when you look at it a bit more, but I hope that it's less so. And what it basically describes is the relationship between the environment, what we call our working memory, and our long-term memory. And the ways in which we try to transfer things that are in our working memory, our short-term memory, into our long-term memory. And how easily we forget things, but how important the storage of things in our long-term memory is for when we are taking, when we're teaching and when students are learning in the classroom. And I want to sort of speak to those concepts, but also to this idea that learning is about a change in your long-term memory. Sometimes it struck me, and I found myself guilty of this, that in classroom observations, I don't know if people regularly go into each other's classes or if you've watched someone else teach, and it's sometimes the case that, especially if in our school we have a kind of an appraisal system, and part of that appraisal is for a senior teacher to go into another teacher's classroom and then kind of offer feedback from the observation. And one of the things they say often is, there was evidence of learning happening. And that's something I would have said myself a number of years ago. But what you realize is that learning is an incredibly hard thing to see, certainly, in a short space of time. And it's one of the key principles, I think, to reflect upon is the fact that learning takes place over time. And sometimes it's not very visible, and it's often quite complicated. And it's something which is sometimes not observable, not in a direct way. So it's a very kind of elusive concept, the nature of learning, I think, and I find it very interesting. So if we were to look at this sort of very simple picture here, I think if we think of our long-term memory as a bit like the map that you can see on the screen, and then what we call our working memory or our short-term memory is the author that's joining parts of that map together, finding connections and building links between the elements that are stored in our long-term memory, and then making use of those elements to try to arrive at new forms of knowledge. Now, the problem with this is that we forget things. Our memories are not very reliable and they're easily forgotten. And you may or may not have seen this sort of graph before, but it's actually from a German psychologist called, I've forgotten his first name, but his second name is Ebbinghaus. And I think this goes back to the late 19th century, when he did a lot of studies about how quickly we forget things. So if you think of students in your classrooms, and then within, one day of leaving your classroom, it's likely that they will have remembered only 50%. And then over the course of the week, that drops down to about 10%. So we quickly and easily forget stuff. And I thought we'd just put that to sort of the test, really, as a way to demonstrate how working memory can sometimes let us down or sometimes present problems, and how easily we forget things. So if I've just put up, I'm going to put up here some, I can't see you, so I don't know whether you're able to do this, but I'm going to put up some letters on the screen. And after 5 seconds, I'm going to say to you, can you close your eyes and can you say those letters out loud? Okay, so here come the first set of letters. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you close your eyes and then say those letters out loud. And then when if you think you've got them right, then open your eyes and check, did you get them right? Okay, that's probably not too difficult for most people, I would imagine. So here's the second set of letters. And again, have a look at them. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to learn them, and then you're going to close your eyes and see if you can say them out loud without looking at the screen. So here they come. And you've got 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Close your eyes. Say them out loud. See if you got them right. And then open your eyes and check. And then you may or may not have done that. I hope that you did. If you did, that's great. If you didn't, don't worry too much. But I wonder how easily we'll find the next set of letters. So slightly longer, 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Close your eyes, see how you get on. Okay. And now open them again And how did you do? How did you get on? Did you manage it or not? Probably not, right? I tried this with some students, and very few of them managed to get this. But what about if I turn those letters into something that you might find easier to remember? Now, those are the same letters, but they've been rearranged in terms of letters that you might recognize. So BBC, GTV, which I think is the Ghanaian TV company, CNN and Fox, which of course are very large corporate TV news channels in America. And of course, I suspect that that would be much easier to remember. And the reason, of course, is that those groups of letters are stored in our long-term memory. So the challenge is to try to work out how we can best unscramble and make sense of these elements that are in our working memory and transfer them into our long-term memory, where we can extract them and draw them down as and when we need to. Now, the other concept, which is just worth mentioning at the outset, is what we call schema. And schema is really the term we give to describe the connections between elements that are in our long-term memory. So a novice learner, when we're starting out to learn something, we might just have very small kind of connections between 2 or 3 different disparate elements. And here we are as a student struggling to connect them with existing knowledge. We can't refer them to anything. But then as we develop as learners, we find more connections. We are able to make more connections between things we're learning in our working memory, things that are coming in, and then things that we already know in our long-term memory. So that by the time we become an expert, we have formed multiple connections and that we can fluently refer to and recall existing knowledge. And what that means for us as learners is it frees up what we call space in our working memory. We can think about things more deeply, and we can also undertake what we call self-directed investigation. So that means, I suppose, thinking about things for ourselves, thinking independently. So what we're all aiming, of course, for is those kind of solidified, strengthened schema in our long-term memory that then present all kinds of opportunities for us as learners. And that's all very well, but how do we get to that point? How do we form those schema, and how do we make those connections in our long-term memory? So I want to talk for a few minutes now about what that might mean for us as teachers and for our students as learners in the classroom. And the first principle I would say is this: what you know determines what you learn. And I think what that means is, and it's something which I've thought about a lot the last few years, as an English teacher, I think I'd always been encouraged to think of my subject as a sort of skills-based subject. You know, it's just about learning to write essays, or it's about learning how to speak out in class, or, you know, contribute to a discussion. But so much of learning in my subject, I've realized, is actually as much about knowledge as it is about skills. And so what I think about now in terms of my own teaching is to try to introduce knowledge as much as I do skills into my students, so that they can then apply that knowledge in different contexts. Here's a quotation: "In order to create rich and coherent knowledge schemes, students must actively insert new information into existing knowledge structures. Making students' prior knowledge explicit is a first step in learning and can help you to recognize weaker learners, determine the level of your lesson, or group students into different level groups." So recognizing the significance of knowing things as a kind of underlying principle that helps us to learn things and for us to teach our learners is the first step. But then also, as teachers, trying to find out what it is that students already know so that we can build on that knowledge and teach them effectively and at the right level is, of course, a significant challenge for us. But it's a very important one. It's an essential one, in fact. And the first principle, the first kind of way of attending to that idea, I would say, is through engaging what we call regular review. So this is a graphic which, fairly simply, but it's borne out by studies, shows that if students, and of course us as teachers, engage in reviewing our learning and going back to our previous learning over a period of time, then it is far more likely that storage in our long-term memory will take place. So if after 3 days our learning has dropped to sort of 60% or less, but if we review that learning after 1 day, we will find that the drop is much less significant, and we retain information far more readily. And by the 7th day, if we have engaged in regular review over a period of time, then our learning is pretty much solid, and we are remembering far more than we would have done otherwise. So the importance of review is the first thing. And the second thing is, you will see from the top of that graphic, is that if we gradually increase the number of days between each sort of review period, then we are forcing our brains to work a bit more hard, so that, let's say, for example, on the top line between day 3 and 6, there's a 3-day gap, and there was only 1 day gap and then 2 days gap in the first 2 retrieval practice sessions. But 3 days therefore makes it more difficult, and it makes it more effortful for the students. But in so doing, it is likely to result in far more solid and strengthened learning taking place. So I showed this to the students to help them think about how to revise for a test or for an examination, and trying to argue essentially to them that they shouldn't kind of see learning for an exam as sort of cramming the night before. That's the worst thing to do. But also that they shouldn't just sort of do biology 1 day and then do English the next day and chemistry on another day. That they should interweave the different subjects, and then have more study sessions, but over a longer period of time, but less in terms of the time they spend on each subject. And that's far more powerful as a tool and as a technique to help them to learn. If you're interested in this stuff, this is a book I would recommend, and there are lots of resources, even if you can't get hold of the book, that this person, Kate Jones, has online. If you type her name into, whoops, it's gone, type her name into Google, and you will see lots of practical examples of how you can encourage students to know things by engaging in what she calls retrieval practice. And really, in a sense, it comes down to this idea of self-testing, or you testing the students and the students self-testing. And the reason why that's, I think for me, again, this has been for me a sort of shift in my own thinking, that I've often thought of testing as being just about getting grades and getting percentages and all of that. But actually, of course, the research shows that if you remove testing from the idea of a final grade and from a performance, and you think about testing as a way to help learning by engaging in retrieval practice, then you'll see how powerful testing is, because testing is a way to store things in your long-term memory and to make those connections really solid. So testing can be extremely powerful and extremely influential and extremely helpful. So in classroom context, there are lots of things that we can do to encourage retrieval practice. And it doesn't have to be, of course, just in the form of a test or an exam at the end of a unit of work, or at the end of the week, or whatever. So asking students things like, what key words did you learn last lesson? Ask your partner 3 questions based on the content we've covered this term. State 3 key facts from last lesson, and so on. These kinds of questions, often perhaps at the beginning of a lesson, and helping students to recall what happened last lesson or what happened last week, to put that learning into the present and bring it into the context of the classroom, can be extremely powerful as a way to encourage students to form connections between ideas, but also to strengthen the knowledge that they have and are continuing to have in their long-term memory. I quite like this game that is also suggested in the book. It's called Walkabout Bingo, and essentially what it means is students are given a sheet with questions on a particular topic. They're not allowed to answer those questions themselves. They have to get up off their chairs and walk around and ask the others in the room, and they can only ask one student or one of their friends one question at a time. And the aim then is to have all the questions answered by different members of the group, and the first person to manage that shouts out bingo, and they've won the prize, as it were. Another aspect, another retrieval practice that you could try is list it. And this is very simple. At the beginning of a lesson, perhaps, or at the end of a lesson, or any time really, list as many keywords as you can are connected to our topic. List as many facts as you can are linked to our topic. List as many facts as you can about a previous topic. List as many key events or individuals we've studied. List as many causes of X as you can, or Y as you can. List as many themes as you can, and so on and so forth. And if we ask this, perhaps at the beginning of a lesson or at some point in the lesson, and we give students a time limit, we say, you've got 1 minute, 3 minutes, whatever, to list as many, it can be, again, a very powerful retrieval practice that can help students to recall and then solidify things in their long-term memory. Another one, and the template for this can easily be accessed online from that person whose name is Kate Jones. If you think this is the colors here in this graph, on this graphic, ask students a range of different questions based on the length of time it has been since you studied that topic. So the bright yellow is from last lesson. The sort of dull green color is from last week, and then we have 2 weeks ago, and then the bright green is from further back in time. And if you want to, you can sort of what's called gamify it. So you can ask students to go around the room or just to answer them themselves and see if they can answer these questions. And the easier ones are the 1-point ones that you can remember from last lesson, but you might get 4 points if you answer a question from much further back. So an example would be something that looks like this. This is one on history, and this is one a teacher has written, quite quickly and just kind of color coded by highlighting in a crayon or whatever. And you can see why some of the questions, the ones in bright red, it says, was North Korea communist or not? What date, 8-year date, did the public censure Senator McCarthy, etc. I don't know the topic, but to do with the sort of post-1950s America and McCarthyism and whatnot. But some of the questions are more straightforward, and you will have studied them more recently. Others require you to go back, perhaps in time, maybe as much as a year, to recollect them. So that's a very good example, once again, of how you can encourage students to think and reflect, not just on something that's happened fairly recently, but something that happened, a fairly long time ago. And of course, there's an incredibly helpful resource out there in the form of the internet and digital resources. And if your students have access to digital devices, whether it's through phones or through laptops or any other sort of digital device, then there are loads and loads and loads of different digital sources that can help students to engage in retrieval practice. Two of the ones that I use in my classes are these: Quizlet, which is a very popular one for the students, which is a really brilliant piece of software that you can set up flashcards, mini tests, and all the rest of it. And you can use that live in the classroom as well, and have the students split into groups and work collaboratively in response to a bunch of questions. And then Mentimeter or Menti.com is a sort of similar idea, but a similar kind of piece of software, but it's much more about polls and quizzes and opinion scales. And you can put a question on the board and ask students, what they think their answer is or who they agree with and so on. And I think one of the advantages of using something like this is that it takes away the kind of personal element. So students will anonymously answer a question, and they can then work out whether they got the answer right or wrong. But it's not so exposing. They're not going to put their hand up and then be told that their answer is wrong. They will find out for themselves, but it can be a bit more private and discreet, and slightly less intimidating or embarrassing, perhaps. So if you have access to these kinds of things, they're very much worth checking out. And it may be that you have other sources or other systems that you use, which might be as good, if not more effective. And the last thing I would just say about these digital devices in this context is that they're very good for promoting self-reflection. So students kind of thinking about what they know, thinking about where the gaps are in their knowledge, and then thinking about what they need to do to overcome those gaps and to fill those gaps in. In presenting materials, the last sort of concept in this area I want to mention is what we call cognitive load. So when we are engaging in retrieval practice, and also when we're teaching students new knowledge, we need to pay attention to what's called cognitive load. And that means basically when our brain gets full. So we all experienced cognitive overload when I gave you that little exercise at the beginning, and we got to the third line of letters and we realized they're just too many letters to remember in 5 seconds. And we probably just gave up. We probably just said, I can't do this, not in the time that I've been given. And so limiting the number and complexity of new elements, breaking complex ideas or procedures into smaller steps, helping students to assimilate concepts into and extend our existing schemas, minimizing extraneous, irrelevant, or distracting input from either content or environment. Now, there's quite a complicated series of statements there, but fundamentally what it is about is simply making sure we're not giving the students too much and expecting of them too much in a way that then causes them to experience cognitive load and then stop learning from taking place. And that, of course, is where the skill of the teacher really comes in, as to how to make that judgment. So how to avoid cognitive overload? Well, presenting information in a clear and organized manner, breaking it down into steps, using repetition and rehearsal, so lots of retrieval practice through things like quizzing. A term that's been very sort of well covered in lots of recent literature has been to do with scaffolding. So helping students through building a scaffold for their learning. And then as they become more independent and able to manage it, the scaffold can then be taken down. And then what we call chunking and visualization. So chunking means bringing a piece of information together. And because we know that learning happens as much through our visual apparatus as our auditory apparatus, through what we see as much as through what we hear, making use of visual elements can be very powerful to reduce the problem of cognitive load or cognitive overload. So making your resources visual, encouraging the students to make use of visual elements, whether it's through color or whether it's through little diagrams or drawings, perhaps to support them when they're revising for a test, can be really powerful. And then the last thing on this concept really is what we call metacognition. So I think that it's not just useful for us as teachers to be aware of the nature of how students learn, but for students themselves to be given some of this information so they can recognize what they need to do and to encourage them to self-reflect on what they need to do in order to make their learning better. So if a student is asking themselves, let's say at the planning stage, do I understand the task I'm being asked to do? Or if they're having to write an essay on something, how many paragraphs will I use and what will go in each? That's the first stage. And then thinking about, as they're writing their introduction or when they've written their introduction, has the introduction been effective? Which does it address the task? Have I written enough for each paragraph? And then once it's all complete, once the essay is written, going back and thinking, have I answered the question effectively? Have I structured my writing effectively and used a range of different sentence types? So encouraging students to go back at their learning and look at what they've done and think about how effectively it completes the task and it fulfills the task. To try to encourage them to think for themselves about whether or not the essay is going to get a good mark before it gets handed in and the teacher gives feedback is incredibly powerful. So metacognition and what we call self-regulating are really crucial. And we can teach this. So we can show our students how to think about a task, illustrating the what, the how, and the why of the thinking process. So quite often, for example, in my English lessons, I'll be standing at the board and trying to do an essay or trying to plan an essay myself. And I'm talking out loud as I'm explaining my thinking processes to the students. And then once I've gone through that process, I then say to them, right, now you have a go at this, see what you can manage. I think making explicit the stages of the lesson from a teacher standing at the front, demonstrating a piece of knowledge or a concept, and then working with the students in the middle part of the lesson on we do together, and then finally asking the students to do things on their own, can also be modeling the reflective process. promoting reflection. Encourage your students to reflect on what they have studied, what went well, what did they find difficult, what do they need to do next in order to be able to learn better. And then teaching your students to ask themselves questions at each stage of their learning. Am I understanding what the teacher is saying? Do I understand what I need to do next? Do I need to ask a question to help me to understand? So the more you can encourage students to engage in these practices, the more you're teaching them to think for themselves. And I think that's very powerful. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing I wanted to cover, the first half, which is really just about sort of how learning happens and the ways in which students can be facilitated to understand the nature of their learning, and how teachers can improve the way that learning happens in lessons through understanding the science of learning, the cognitions. So I want to see now, the second bit really is to talk a bit about how those ideas can present themselves in the notion of engaging students in our lessons. And this came out of some thinking I've been doing recently about quieter students in my classes. And going back to what I said before about the difficulty of seeing learning happening, I think sometimes we often think that, you know, students who put their hands up in their class and students who are talkative are the most engaged in their learning. But sometimes it's actually not the case. Sometimes those students who put their hands up and answer the questions aren't actually thinking as much as the quieter student who's sitting at the back and who maybe doesn't have the confidence to put his or her hand up, but is actually far more thoughtful and reflective and, you know, thinking about what's actually going on. So engaging students is quite a kind of broad and complicated concept, but I thought it might be worth just thinking a little bit about it now. What do we mean by student engagement? Well, the research into this area is really interesting. And in my own reading, it has come down to a kind of consensus that defines engagement in these three broad ways. So there can be emotional engagement in lessons. And this means, how do students feel about their learning? How do they react when they get something wrong? How much are they enjoying their lessons? Do they like group work? How do they manage group work? And how do they function with other students when they're being asked to work together? Then there's the more kind of active behavioral approach to student engagement. And what this means is speaking up in class, nodding head, making notes independently, making eye contact, demonstrating positive body language. And that's the most visible thing to see. And often what people say when they think about student engagement is they're talking about behavioral engagement in a lesson. But it's very difficult and very different to talk about emotional or cognitive engagement. So cognitive engagement really is about learning, okay, and self-regulation strategies, students doing what we've just been talking about, which is reflecting on the nature of their own learning, and then also being strategic. And the best students, the ones that do the best in the end, are often successful, not because they're the smartest necessarily, but because they reflect on their learning and they deliberately and consciously make decisions about what to do next in order to make their learning more effective. And so cognitive engagement is perhaps incredibly powerful, but as I said before, not easy to see in a very obvious way. I wonder how students are encouraged to participate in your lessons. Here are some possibilities. Students can be asked to think in silence about the answer to a question. Sometimes we ask students to volunteer answers by raising their hands. Sometimes we ask students to think of an answer to a question, but we cold call them, as it's called, which means that we ask, you know, student A or student B or student C what their answer is without them putting their hands up. I don't know if people use mini whiteboards, which are these kind of just very sort of cheap kind of boards that you can use in a classroom, and students can write their answers down and hold the boards up. And if you do use them, I think they're very powerful, and there's lots of research that shows how powerful they are. And I suppose it can even be done, you know, on pieces. The advantage of a whiteboard is that you can rub it out, and students can kind of reuse them, as opposed to just writing their answer onto a piece of paper or something, which then becomes wasted. A voting system, such as using your fingers. So, if you ask a question and you say, put one finger up if you think your answer is A, two fingers B, and three fingers C, or whatever, or it's true or false. And if you ask students to do this in front of their chest, in front of them like this, where other students can't see, it means that you can judge whether you can find out whether they know the answer or whether they don't. Because one of the problems with for us as teachers trying to make sense of what students know is that they're often kind of influenced by their students, their friends around them, and they'll just kind of, if they don't know the answer, they'll just say what their friend has said. And that's not helpful to you, because you want to know whether they do know or whether they don't. And if they don't know, you need to, we want to be able to teach them. So here are some different, I won't go through all of these, but these are various ways in which we might encourage students to participate in our lessons. And one of the things that, again, this for me is a rather personal thing, in the sense that I've become, I use this more often than anything else, I think, in my classes now, in this context. And that's to what we call wait time. Research shows that on average, when a teacher asks a question, the length of time between asking the question and then students responding, giving their answer, is between 0.7 and 1.4 seconds. There's a very, very short space of time. If you simply increase that length of time to 3 seconds, it makes a huge difference to the thinking that more than one student is likely to do. So a 3-second rule is a very easy practice to adopt. And what you find is that students then have a bit longer to think about their answer. They can improve the length of their responses. There'll be fewer students who simply say, I don't know. It does and has been shown to improve academic achievement. It can increase language and command of syntax and vocabulary. And it's also very beneficial for students with special educational needs, because they have a bit more time and they feel a bit less under pressure to answer a question when they have when there's only a second or so to answer it. I'd also say that it has benefits for teachers. It means that we can think about the questions that we want to ask more carefully. We can ask more varied kinds of questions, and it's more likely to result in additional questions that require complex information processing. So a student, because they're giving a more thoughtful answer, you can then build on that answer in a more thoughtful and measured and careful way. So you may get through fewer questions than you would have done otherwise, but I can absolutely guarantee the level of thought in your classes will be far more strong and much better as a result. A couple of other things that I would mention is how do we highlighting the means of participation. So, for example, instead of saying, what is the formula to calculate speed, put up your hand, or write it on your mini whiteboards, we would say something like this. We're going to do the next bit in silence, and we wait. Then we're going to say, take out your mini whiteboards or take out your exercise books, and we wait. And then you remind the students, remember, we want to do this in silence. And then we say, on your mini whiteboards, write down the formula to calculate speed. So we bring into focus, as it were, the way in which we want students to participate. And this is a very helpful way to maximize learning by breaking it down. Another series of examples of this would be, you say, without talking, in silence, I want you to write down 3 things, which are whatever. Or you say, by putting up your hand, I'd like you to tell me your answer to this question. Or in pairs, I want you to discuss. In silence, you're going to. Without turning to your neighbor, get your red pen out. I don't want to hear anyone call out their answers as we start marking. So what that means is referring to the means of participation in your classroom. And if you highlight that, you make that clear, you bring it into focus in the classes, then again, you're going to have more effective responses and more likely to have students engage more thoroughly, especially if you make this quite varied. So you don't always have, hands go up. You don't always have answers written down on their exercise book or on the mini whiteboard. You don't always work in silence. If you vary the means of participation, that keeps students engaged. Cold calling is, of course, when you ask individual students to answer. So you say, I don't want your hands to go up. I'm going to ask individual students their answer to this. And teachers in my school have sometimes said to me, well, doesn't that come across as quite intimidating? Doesn't that make students who are shyer or less confident sort of feel under pressure? And that can be true. I think that can be true. But if you talk about the reasons why you are going to cold call this particular part of the lesson, it can really help those students to understand the reasons and then feel less intimidated. So it says, so when I call your name, it's because I really want to hear what you think. Everyone's thoughts are valuable. I want to be able to help you if you're struggling, because I'm sure others will be struggling too. And I want to be able to help others with your answer if they don't understand. So if I call your name, don't worry. Just tell me what you think the answer is. And if I don't call your name, don't worry either. You'll get your chance soon. So to avoid any potential problem associated with students feeling under pressure, talking about why you're going to cold call, I think, can be a way to counter that issue. Another very practical thing is this. We often sort of we just say, let's call the student Mark, that's my name. Mark, tell me your answer to this question. Now, if I do that, then Mark is the one that's under pressure straight away, and all of the other students can switch off. Mark's got to do it. That's his problem, not mine. And they might feel that therefore they stop learning. But you can vary that. So instead of saying in version 1, it's called Harry, let's call him Harry or Mark. Can you tell me Pythagoras' theorem? Harry says, yes, he tells the answer. Teacher says, fantastic. Okay, next question. Now, I wonder what you think the problem with that would be. Well, I hope you're thinking partly what I've just said, which is that Harry has to answer the question and that Harry gets it right, and everyone else who may not know the answer has, it's been assumed that perhaps all the others in their class know the answer, when of course they probably don't, or they might not. So it's what you're trying to do is maximize all students' engagement. So if the teacher simply says, okay, no shouting out, everyone silent thinking, what is Pythagoras' theorem? And then you say, Harry, everybody has to engage in the answer to the question because they're not sure who the teacher's going to pick, because the teacher has saved the name until the end of that sentence. And it's a way to try to maximize student engagement. Another example in the version 2 is, okay, no shouting out, everyone silent thinking. What is Pythagoras' theorem, Harry? And the only change here is just to introduce the silent thinking idea. So to bring into the foreground the means of participation, silent thought, as opposed to hands going up. And then the last version of this is, okay, no shouting out, everyone silent thinking, and then we introduce some of that wait time. What is Pythagoras' theorem? And then we wait again for 3 seconds, and then we say, Harry, okay? And the chances are that's likely to result in more than just Harry answering the question or thinking about the answer to that question. And it's also more likely to promote, a continuous and further thought, because then the teacher might say, thank you, Harry. And then Kyle, what did you think of what Harry had just said? Think about your answer and then tell us. So it's a very seemingly quite a simple way of just thinking about your question and answering, but it can be very powerful to engage more students than just 1 or 2 in the process of answering the questions. If you do have access to mini whiteboards, I can't say how good they are. I think they are just fantastic. If you ask a question and you say to students, can you please write down your answer on the mini whiteboard? You can then go around the room and you can see who has got the answer right or who hasn't. You can use them to sort of hold up their answers, and students can kind of look at each other's work. And with whiteboards, they can easily become a bit of a pain in some respects, because students, if they have a pen and they have a whiteboard, might be just drawing, doodling on them, or writing things that are inappropriate. So you have to establish a set of behavioral rules. So if the whiteboards come out, they stay on the desk. You don't touch the pen until the teacher says so. Right, pick up your whiteboards, pick up your pen, and then put the pen down, and so on and so forth. But mini whiteboards are incredibly powerful for students in classrooms to enable you to see who is actually engaging in the learning and who understands what you've asked them to what you're trying to teach them. But also it's quite an active kind of thing, so they're not just hiding behind in their exercise books. They're doing something, and they can hold them up and hold their answers and show their answers, and they often quite enjoy it for that reason too. Other things that people might like to try, you may again already do this, it's all about you as a teacher trying to work out whether a student has understood a topic and making sure that all students are engaging in the lesson. In this context, behavioral engagement. So as I said before, the fingers or the thumbs, true or false cards, red, amber, green cards, electronic voting systems are the ones I've just shown you. And here we've got an example in the photograph. It's not very good quality, but students on the back of their exercise book just have 4 letters. And you might ask a question and you hold up your exercise book in a particular way with the letter that you think the answer is at the top. And then presumably in that case, I would imagine A was the right answer, and all those students who are holding up A are getting the answer right. But if a student was holding up B, you would then be able to see that that student's got the answer wrong, and then you would be able to adjust your teaching for that student. And the other thing about putting them on the exercise book in that way is that they can't see what each other has done. And that's very powerful, because sometimes students will, when they're not sure of an answer, they will kind of, check at what their friend has written down, and they'll just copy them. So you don't know if they know the answer or not. But the exercise book can be a very good way to avoid that. Other options, very simple ones. Here's a question. Close your eyes. Hold up 1 finger if you think the answer is this. Hold up 2 fingers if you think the answer is that. Again, with their eyes closed, they can't see what their friends are doing, so that you can know for sure whether they've understood it and that they're not just copying their friends. Call and response is again a similar sort of idea. Instead of a 9-sided shape is called we say, okay, we're going to do a call and response for the next question. So think in silence, wait for my countdown. A 9-sided shape is called a 3, 2, 1, and then they all come out with the answer. And students like this because everyone's speaking together at the same time. And it can be very powerful as a way to engage students in the lesson. Not so straightforward as a way to help you work out what the students have understood or not understood, but a great way to get the lesson kind of liven a lesson up and to encourage that kind of practical participation. And then the last thing really to cover on this is what we call think, pair, share. And again, for me, this has been a kind of game changer in my own teaching, so that instead of a teacher asking a question and then students answering it, you say, here's a question. What do you think Shakespeare meant by this line? Don't tell me your answer. I want you to write your answer down. And then I want you to tell the person next to you what you've written down, or talk about your answer with the person next to you. And then you can, especially helpful for students who are shyer, who are less confident, that they, in talking to the person next to them, will always have therefore something to say. Because once you've given them 30 seconds or so to talk about the answer with the person next to you, you can then say, right, David, what did you think? Or Lawrence, tell me what David said. And you can, encourage the students to feed back on what was discussed, rather than feel under pressure and under the spotlight by being the only person that you're asking. And there's a bunch of other things here. It might be that if a student individually has come up with a different answer to the person next to them, then can you come up with a consensus as to which is correct? Or if your answers are the same, how would you explain your answers to someone who doesn't understand? Checking their listening. Tell me what your partner said. This is the better too short than too long. When you ask students to engage in discussion, whether that's as a pair or as a small group, sometimes there can be lots of lively chatter, and that's very nice. It's always better to cut that chatter short when it's at its loudest. Don't wait for it to dwindle down and then come in with the next question. If you cut it short when it's at its loudest, you are maintaining the energy in the room and keeping up that sense of active engagement and active participation. And then the last example there is asking questions to find the best discussions to share. So put up your hand if you disagree with your partner, put up your hand if you changed your mind during the discussion, put up your hand if your partner said something you found interesting. If that's the case, then that might be the pair to get to feedback to the class, because if student A disagreed with student B, that's an interesting thing to share, to talk about why the disagreement happened. Or if someone says, you know, they changed their mind, and then you ask them, well, tell me, why did you change your mind? Why did you go from A to B? And that could probably also yield some really interesting material for the classroom. And then just quickly on this, again, as an English teacher, I suppose since I was trained many years ago, that we were always told, you know, to have lots of talking in the lesson, lots of classroom, group work, all of that sort of thing. But of course, again, this is reinforced with lots and lots of studies and research. Learning happens often in silence. And so using silent practices in your lessons can be a very powerful way to encourage students to think and to reflect for themselves. So having a silent time during or at the end of a lesson, or in silence, the teacher at the front modeling something that you want the students to learn on the board. And silence can be incredibly powerful, I think. And it struck me, there's a book called Quiet by a lady called Susan Olin, whose name is on the right there. And she writes in this book very persuasively for me about how talking and extrovert behavior is very much a kind of, in the context of her book, a kind of Western approach to teaching and learning in particular classrooms. And in other cultures and other traditions, there's much greater emphasis on silent reflection and silent learning, which is incredibly powerful. And also, of course, much less intimidating for students who find talking more intimidating. Now, it doesn't mean that students who don't contribute verbally can, as it were, be let off the hook, because a lot of the time studies show that however profound the thinking is, if it's not accompanied by talk, as this quotation shows, then the learning will be less powerful and less effective. So there needs to be some element of classroom talk at some point for students to properly articulate what it is that's inside their heads. If they were silent all the time, that wouldn't work. But nevertheless, using silence can be a very powerful and very effective and very significant thing to use in your classrooms and to encourage your students to be able to do. So just to finish, this is a graphic which shows kind of what we're aiming for, really, when we're talking about student participation. Knowing what we do about the way that students learn and how the brain works and how memory happens. We want to maximize opportunity for thinking and also opportunity for participation. And that's where the zone on the top right here really, you know, comes into its own, when we have as many students as possible thinking hard, but also participating actively in a lesson. I'm going to skip over that because that's sort of taking me slightly away from things. This is the last one. One of the things I think it's incredibly powerful to do is to encourage, I don't know the context in which your students are working, but in the school where I am, a lot of the students are obsessed really just with grades and the mark on the end of the test. And it's a kind of thing that's, I suppose, a worldwide phenomenon. But trying to get students to see the difference between what we call performance-based learning, which is, you know, how you did in the test, versus what we call mastery. Students who adopt learning rather than performance goals are focused on learning, mastering the task, understanding and trying to accomplish something that's challenging. Intrinsically motivated students prefer challenge and are persistent when faced with difficulty. Each of these concepts emphasizes the degree to which students are invested in value learning. So you may have heard of the concept of growth mindset in America, a lady called Carol Dweck, if you've heard of this, but this is also kind of based on the idea of mastery of a topic rather than obsessing with the grade. Because if a student obsesses with the grade, usually, often they just stop learning because they're not thinking about you know, what they need to do next to do better in the test. They're just thinking about, oh, brilliantly, you know, brilliant, I got my A grade, I'm fine, or oh, I'm rubbish at maths because I only got a D, or whatever it might be. And you want to get that out of the way and focus on, if you have a test, let's not worry about the grade. Let's focus on the way that the test gave us feedback about what you can do and what you do know and what you can't do and what you don't know. And that's, if you can encourage students to think about learning in that way, then you are going to be encouraging them to be much more self-motivated and much more effective and powerful as learners long term, not just for the exam. Okay, I'm going to stop because that's all I have to say. I know I've covered an awful lot of information there, and I'd be very happy to share the PowerPoint with you, Lawrence, if people would find it useful. And equally, that's my email on the screen. If anybody would like to be in touch and discuss anything I've said, or ask questions, or share practices that you have found effective or powerful, I'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to do so. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. It's been very insightful.
Not at all, Lawrence.
And for me, I mean, I'm connecting with some of the concepts that we've discussed, or you've taken us through in several ways, especially on the point of self-reflection.
Brilliant.
How that, as a teacher myself, we sometimes can do poorly when it comes to how well we can embed reflection through as a pedagogical tool. And you'd realize that even that connection with silence, and I mean, you mentioned silence in the latter part of the conversation, and how that even connects with reflection.
Absolutely.
Just some thoughts to add to what you've been saying, because then I think sometimes what I am taking away is that the fact that when it becomes a pedagogical tool, we then begin not to see it as a sign of disengagement from learning. And this brings me back to the point on silence. And then again, as teachers, sometimes we focus more on the assessment. Of course, there's also that factor of time constraints and how that can affect how that we see silence as a pedagogical tool. And so I think it's been very insightful. I have, let me say, some questions to ask, but then if you have any questions, please do. We'll give Mark, I don't know if you can spare some 5 minutes.
Of course I can. Just on that, Lawrence, I'm very interested in what you say about the reflection and silence. I'd love maybe a future date we could have another session which we talk about reflection. Is something that I've become very interested in, and how you encourage students to be more self-reflective as practitioners, as learners, is a really interesting topic, I think. And I'd love to talk more about that at some point. So maybe at a future date we could talk to each other. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just a quick one on your point regarding schemas. You mentioned schemas, you mentioned existing information, existing knowledge, but then I want to find out how that can stifle creativity in learners. How do we ensure that over-reliance on existing knowledge, especially when it comes to young learners, does not stifle creativity?
I don't think it stifles creativity at all. I think it's the opposite. I think it encourages creativity. I think, it's one of those things that, schema really is simply a way of describing how connections are formed in the brain, and how new knowledge can attach itself to another piece of knowledge that already exists. There was a little video going around on Twitter or something, I remember about a year ago, and it was just an image, incredibly, obviously, very highly magnified image of a neuron reaching out and trying to connect with something around it. And it was quite moving, this thing, and then eventually it does kind of find one, and it forms this connection, and then more connections happen, and you watch this growing schema develop in the form of these neurons reaching out and trying to find someone to connect with. And that in itself is fascinating. But I think when it comes to creativity, I think again that the more that students know, it doesn't mean in the sense, so I think knowledge, not to think of knowledge in a sort of facts thing, that I know when Shakespeare was born or died or whatever, is not going to make me any more creative. But experiencing creativity and understanding how creativity can happen, and talking about what means that makes something creative, is also part of forming schema in your mind that can then be applied at future dates. So I think, schema is really just schema is really just a description of how learning happens. That's all that is. Which if we want learning to happen, we're going to have schema become formed. But when it comes to creativity, I've come to think actually that there's as much sort of knowledge that needs to be there in order for creativity to take place. because without the knowledge of what it means to write an interesting story, or without the knowledge of how to play the guitar or whatever, I'm not going to be able to do anything creative with it, right? So I think we need to think about knowledge in a broader sense, but I don't see any difference fundamentally between knowing something in a creative sense and knowing something in a more traditional academic context.
Interesting. And in terms of, just to also give others opportunity, in terms of when you talk of the cognitive load and you relate that to retrieving information and memory, in your own practice, what are some signs that students exhibit, to send a signal that, no, I'm at that breaking point,
Well, I mean, there are the very obvious signs, which are that they're clearly and visibly switching off in a lesson, right? So, they look bored, or they're disengaged in some obvious behavioral way, and that's an obvious thing. But of course, a more serious way, I suppose, is to, and I think one of the things that is important to reflect upon is the idea that feedback that we give the students should not be thought of as something that happens, once a week or whatever when they turn in their homework. But feedback is much more powerful when it's happening live in the context of a lesson. So as much as possible, to maximize opportunities for you to be able to assess whether the student is understanding what you're saying and learning anything from what you're saying, is an essential tool in this respect, because only when you ask the students, their answer to a question, or to write down this or that, and then you finding out that they are not getting it right, can you then realize possibly that either they don't understand it, or that their cognitive load has become too much. So it's, I mean, obviously there's lots of examples of different ways in which cognitive overload can take place, but it's very much, I think, about teachers being sensitive to what's going on in the context of a classroom, that you can read through, going back to what I said before about the difference between emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. In all three areas, you can see cognitive overload happening, but it's fascinating and it's complex, and it's not straightforward, because, as I said before, students who may be answering the question all the time may be experiencing cognitive overload. It's just that they want to be seen to be pleasing the teacher, or they want to be seen to be showing off in front of their friends or whatever, but they may be just as cognitively limited in the sense that they've stopped learning as someone who isn't putting their hand up. So it's not straightforward, but I think the more we can think about lesson time as an opportunity, not just to teach things, but also to find out whether what you are teaching is working, is sinking in, the more likely it is that we'll be sensitive to cognitive overload.
Interesting. So those short moments of checking for understanding.
Exactly. Yeah. Checking for understanding as much as possible. Yeah. I think that's absolutely crucial. Yeah.
Interesting. Joseph, your hand is up.
Yeah.
Hi,
Good
Joseph.
evening, everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, we can
Thank
hear
you very much, Mr. Mark, for your presentation this evening.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. In your presentation, in the preamble, you made mention that what you know determines what you learn.
Yes. Yes.
Very good one. And talking about the schema of students, sometimes you come to realize that what they have is not relevant to what you are trying to take them through.
Yes.
And in the short and long-term memory, you'll be with students, you engage them, but they are not grasping the concepts. But when you create something jovial, or like they watch a movie, they are to narrate and interpret the whole scene without missing it. But whatever you stand before them to give them, rightly you end the lesson, they forget everything.
Yeah.
So how do you help such students to have a schema that is relating to the subject matter?
Okay, so I think that's a great question, and it's you know, I suppose the two things I would say about that are, first of all, I think it's really important for any teacher to find out what it is a student already knows about a topic before you begin to teach a new one, right? So, and that can be a start of unit quiz, for example, or, you know, just or a question and answer session. But I think, you know, making every possible effort to find out what it is that a student already knows. I read some statistic that said in many classes, the average is something like 60% of students already know what you're teaching them, which is kind of frightening, really, because that suggests that we're not really stretching them in any meaningful way. But equally, we can make assumptions about what students know. We can kind of pitch our teaching too high, and which results in students, you know, not being able to keep up. So I think it's crucial that we as teachers, you know, try to establish a kind of baseline about what the knowledge that already exists actually is, which you can do in lots of different ways. And then I think your second area of your question related to, I suppose for me, to the importance of retrieval practice. So yeah, you're right. I mean, as I said at the start, students will often leave a class, and then they've gone from one class to another subject to another subject. And by the time they've gone through 3 subjects, or they're at the end of the day and they're tired, they've forgotten everything you said to them, or what you thought that you'd taught them. So that's why I think this retrieval practice idea is really important, because the more we can actively encourage students to go back and reflect upon previous learning, the more you will build the schema, and the more you will encourage things to stay in their long-term memory, which then, as I said, I think frees up space in the working memory that they don't have to think about, you know. I was asking some students in an assembly, I think I gave them some, you know, a multiplication, something like 12 times 35 or something like that. And, you know, it's not an easy mathematical sum to work out straight away. But I said, you know, ask them and they did it. I said, how did you do it? And of course, it's really all about, well, they know their times tables, so they can work out, I can't remember what I said just then, but you know, they know what 3 7s are, so that can be locked, and then they can apply the other bits, so they can work it out because of the knowledge that's in their long-term memory, and that's been, you know, stored and reused and drawn down and reused again over time, and it's there. But that's only going to happen by continual reinforcing and continual review and retrieval practice. And I think, and I myself, what I'm about to say, I kind of have thought about myself a lot, which is, you might say, well, hang on, that takes time out of a lesson, right? So if you're spending the first 5 minutes doing some kind of retrieval practice quiz, or even more, then you're limiting the time that you've got in the lesson to teach new material. And that's true. However, the benefits that you get longer term from engaging in those kind of retrieval practice exercises are very significant. So the longer term picture is much more significant and much more effective, you know. So I think, I'm guilty of this as much as anyone. I think we often think about our teaching as a little lesson by lesson by lesson, but we ought to think as much, I suppose, about the longer term gains and staggering our teaching, and that means retrieving and going back as much as moving forwards as much as we can, so that the end result is a far more profound student who can remember far more and do far more as a result of that knowledge than they would have done otherwise. So those two things for me is establishing a baseline of knowledge and then retrieval practice would be my answer to that question. I don't know if that's what you're expecting, but I think that's what I would say.
Thank you very much for your explanation. I'm very grateful.
Not at all. It's nice to chat to you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Can you please give us your email in the test chat?
Yes, sorry. Yes, I will.
And Joseph, we will share the resource, so you would get that as well.
All right. Thank you.
All right. A big thank you to Mark for this evening session. In the absence of any questions, I think it will be a good place for us to discharge Mark, who has led us through this very insightful time. I have found it particularly refreshing as an educator and as a trainer with loads of points I've noted down that I'm carrying on to my own practice. So thank you very much, Mark, for this session. Before we sign out, just some announcements. So we have our next Meet the Team events for Ignite Equity coming off next week, Tuesday, 28th May. Please do well to share the teaser with your network and yeah, join so that you can learn more about our gender equity program and how that we go about fostering inclusion in local communities and empowering our catalysts to also promote inclusion in several ways as it relates to gender. And this session is targeted at a wider audience, and so feel free to share it to anyone within your network. Also, please do also subscribe to our newsletter. We share incredible updates about our impact. So you can pick the details, info@eduspots.org, www.eduspots.org. Yeah, just I think you can subscribe to the newsletter using the email that we have provided. And of course, if you go to our website, you'd have this small chat box pop up asking that you subscribe to the email. So you can do that as well. All right, so this is where we draw the curtain. Thank you very much for joining this Ignite Talk. And thank you, Mark, thank you once again for the time that you spent with us. I've noted points regarding reflection, and I think we'll be in touch and explore the possibility of another session. So thank you all, and have a good night.
Let's give him the Tasha dance.
Oh, we should give Mark a Tasha dance, isn't it? Maybe when we meet him in person.
Yes. Okay.
All right, everyone. Good night. Enjoy your evening.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.